Sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to one person's choice to stop and care. In the bitter cold of an early Montana winter, mountain man Ezekiel Brant found an old couple freezing to death in their cabin, abandoned by neighbors who had already given up hope. Most folks would have kept riding, but Zeke knew what it meant to be forgotten by the world. He loaded them onto his horse, shared his own blankets, and rode back through a deadly blizzard to get supplies. He lost part of his ear to frostbite, but he saved their lives. What started as a simple act of kindness would change everything for a struggling mountain town. But would one man's compassion be enough when winter's worst trials were still ahead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains of Montana Territory had a way of stripping a man down to his bones, leaving only what mattered most. For Ezekiel Brant, what mattered was the rhythm of survival, the careful dance between taking what the wilderness offered and respecting what it withheld. 3 years had passed since he'd chosen these peaks as his sanctuary, and in that time, he'd learned to read the language of wind and weather like scripture. His cabin sat nestled against a granite outcrop at 8,000 feet, positioned where the morning sun could find it, but the worst storms would pass overhead. He'd built it himself with timber from the surrounding pines, each log notched and fitted with the precision of a man who understood that sloppy work meant death when winter came calling. The structure was modest but solid. One room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows placed to catch light while maintaining warmth. Inside, everything had its place and purpose. His rifle rested above the mantel, cleaned and ready. Traps hung from pegs along the walls, their steel jaws gleaming with the oil he applied each night. Shelves held his modest library, a worn Bible, a book of poetry that had belonged to his late wife Sarah, and a journal bound in leather that grew softer with each day's handling. It was this journal that held his deepest treasures. Between its pages, pressed like delicate memories, were wildflowers Sarah had picked during their brief, beautiful marriage. Alpine forget-me-nots, Indian paintbrush, and mountain laurel, each bloom carefully preserved, their colors faded but their significance eternal. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed too hard against his chest, he would open the journal and touch these fragile reminders of love. Sarah had been gone 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days. He knew the count because he'd marked each morning in that same journal, a ritual that had begun as torture and evolved into something approaching peace. She had died in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her, leaving Zeke with a grief so complete it had driven him from civilization into these unforgiving peaks. Before the tragedy, he'd been a different man entirely. Ezekiel Brant had owned a small farm outside Helena, raised horses, and dreamed of filling a house with children's laughter. He'd been gregarious then, known for his quick wit and generous spirit. Neighbors sought his advice on everything from broken wagon wheels to broken hearts. But that man had died with Sarah, and what remained was something harder, more solitary, a creature adapted to survive alone. His daily routine had become a meditation on self-sufficiency. He rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and prepared coffee strong enough to wake the dead. While the cabin warmed, he checked his traps, following paths he'd worn into the mountainside over countless mornings. The work was methodical and peaceful, skinning catches, resetting snares, reading the stories written in tracks and scat. Zeke had become fluent in the language of survival. He could predict weather changes by the behavior of birds, identify edible plants even under snow, and navigate by stars when storms obscured familiar landmarks. These skills had kept him alive, but more importantly, they'd given him purpose when purpose seemed impossible to find. The wilderness demanded respect, and he gave it freely. He took only what he needed from the land, wasted nothing, and understood that he was merely borrowing space in a realm that belonged to creatures far older than human ambition. This philosophy had served him well through 3 harsh winters, each one teaching him something new about patience, preparation, and the thin line between life and death. But even in his self-imposed exile, Zeke couldn't entirely escape the pull of human connection. 20 miles below his mountain sanctuary lay Clearwater Ridge, a struggling settlement that had once shown promise as a mining town. He rarely visited, but when supplies ran low or loneliness became unbearable, he would make the journey down the winding trail to trade pelts for necessities. The town had seen better days. What had begun as a hopeful community of miners, merchants and farmers had slowly withered as the silver veins played out and harsh winters drove families eastward to easier lives. Those who remained were a hardy bunch, too stubborn or too poor to leave, clinging to hopes that prosperity might return with the spring. Sam Fletcher ran the general store, a weathered man with kind eyes, who never pried into Zeke's business but always had a hot meal waiting when the mountain man appeared. There was Doc Morrison, who'd given up a profitable practice in Chicago to serve folks who could rarely pay in anything but gratitude. The Murphy family struggled to keep their small farm productive in the short growing season, while the Jacobsons raised 3 children in a cabin that should have housed 1. These glimpses of community life stirred something in Zeke that he tried to ignore. Watching children play in Clearwater Ridge's dusty main street reminded him of dreams he'd buried with Sarah. Hearing families laugh around dinner tables made his own silent cabin feel more like a tomb than a home. But the pain of connection seemed worse than the ache of isolation, so he limited his visits and kept his distance. The autumn of 1887 had brought troubling signs that even Zeke's practiced eye couldn't ignore. The aspens had turned gold earlier than usual, their leaves falling in thick carpets that spoke of winter's early approach. Squirrels gathered nuts with unusual frenzy, and birds that normally lingered through October had already begun their southern migration. Most ominous of all were the clouds, great grey masses that seemed to be gathering strength in the northern peaks, promising snow in quantities that could trap the unprepared for months. Zeke had lived through 3 mountain winters, but something about the approaching season felt different, more dangerous. The air itself seemed to vibrate with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. He'd spent September and early October preparing with even greater care than usual. His woodshed overflowed with split logs, and his small root cellar groaned under the weight of preserved meat, dried vegetables, and other provisions. He'd reinforced his cabin's roof and chinked every gap between logs with fresh moss and clay. If this winter proved as harsh as the signs suggested, he was ready to wait it out in comfort. But preparation could only go so far. No amount of planning could protect against the bone-deep loneliness that intensified as the days grew shorter. Sarah's pressed flowers seemed more fragile with each passing season, and the silence in his cabin sometimes felt so complete it made him question whether he still existed at all. It was during one of these moments of profound solitude that Zeke made his decision to check the southern trap lines. One final time before winter locked the high country in ice. The decision seemed practical. A few more pelts could mean the difference between comfort and mere survival during the long, dark months ahead. But perhaps, deep in his heart, he was hoping for something else entirely, a reason to feel useful again, a reminder that his life still had meaning beyond simple persistence. He saddled his mare, Duchess, at first light, her breath forming silver clouds in the crisp air. The horse was a sorrel with white markings, sturdy and sure-footed on mountain trails. She'd been Sarah's favorite, and keeping her alive had become another way of honoring his wife's memory. Together, they set out through the pine forests that cloaked the mountainsides, following paths that wound between granite boulders and across meadows already touched by frost. The morning was beautiful in the way that only mountain mornings could be, crystal clear, sharp with cold and infinite with possibility. Eagles circled overhead, riding thermals that carried them effortlessly through air, so thin it made every breath feel precious. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, its voice echoing off stone walls that had stood since before humans ever dreamed of conquering such places. Zeke found himself thinking about Sarah as he rode, something he'd trained himself not to do during daylight hours. But the beauty of the morning seemed to demand her presence, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to imagine her riding beside him, pointing out the way frost had turned spider webs into works of art, laughing at the antics of ground squirrels preparing for winter's sleep. The memory was so vivid it made his chest ache. But it also reminded him why he'd chosen this life. In the mountains, surrounded by the eternal rhythms of nature, Sarah's spirit felt closer than it ever did in the company of other people. Here, among the peaks that would outlast all human sorrow, their love seemed less like something lost and more like something transformed. As he guided Duchess down a narrow trail toward the valley floor, Zeke caught sight of smoke rising from the distant trees. It was thin and pale, barely visible against the grey sky, but it was enough to make him pause. Smoke meant people, and people in this remote area usually meant trouble of one kind or another. His instinct was to avoid contact, to circle around whatever human drama might be unfolding below, but something about that fragile thread of smoke tugged at his consciousness. It spoke of struggle, of people trying to stay warm against the approaching winter, and despite his desire for solitude, Zeke found himself unable to ignore its silent plea. He touched his heels to Duchess's flanks and turned toward the valley, not yet knowing that this simple decision would change the course of his life forever. The smoke led Zeke through a stand of lodgepole pines to a clearing where a small cabin hugged the base of a rocky slope. The structure looked older than most settlements in the territory, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to silver grey, with a stone chimney that spoke of careful craftsmanship. But what struck him most was how the smoke seemed wrong. Instead of the steady, confident plume of a well-tended fire, it rose in weak, intermittent puffs, like the last gasps of something dying. Duchess snorted nervously as they approached. Her ears pricked forward at sounds too subtle for human hearing. Zeke dismounted and tied her to a pine branch, then approached the cabin on foot. No dogs barked a greeting, no voices called out in response to the sound of hooves. The silence felt heavy, with more than just mountain stillness. He knocked on the rough wooden door, the sound echoing hollowly in the thin air. "Hello in there," he called, his voice rusty from disuse. "Anyone need help?" A weak voice answered from inside, barely audible through the thick logs. "Please. Help us." Zeke lifted the leather latch and pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. Not the rankness of neglect, but the peculiar odor of people slowly starving, of bodies burning their own reserves to stay alive. The cabin's interior was dim despite the hour, its single window clouded with frost and grime. In the far corner, huddled beneath what appeared to be every blanket, coat and piece of fabric in the place, lay an elderly couple. The woman was tiny, bird-like, with silver hair that had once been carefully braided, but now hung in tangles around her shoulders. Her husband was larger but gaunt, his cheeks hollow and his breathing labored. Both of them watched Zeke with eyes that held too much acceptance of their fate. "Found us," the man whispered, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he'd given up believing anyone would come. Zeke knelt beside their makeshift bed, his practiced eye taking inventory of their condition. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, and hypothermia, but not beyond recovery if treated quickly. "I'm Ezekiel Brant," he said gently. "What are your names?" "Thomas Henley," the man replied, his voice gaining strength from hope. "This is my wife, Martha." Martha tried to smile, but could only manage a slight lifting of her cracked lips. Her left hand clutched something against her chest, a small, faded photograph that she protected even in her extremity. But it was her right hand that caught Zeke's attention. A simple gold wedding band encircled her ring finger, the metal worn thin from decades of wear. The ring had become embedded in swollen flesh, speaking of hands that had once been strong enough for hard work, but had wasted away until only bone and determination remained. "How long since you've had a proper meal?" Zeke asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. 3 days, maybe 4, Thomas admitted. "We'd been making do with what little we had stored, but—" He gestured weakly at empty shelves along the cabin walls. "Winter came early this year, Zeke's eyes swept the cabin, reading the story of their decline. Clean but sparse furnishings suggested people who took pride in their home, despite having little money. A few books on a rough-hewn shelf spoke of education and refinement. But the empty pantry, cold fireplace with only a handful of twigs for fuel, and the couple's obvious weakness painted a picture of slow starvation. "Where's your family?" he asked. "Surely you've got people who—" "Gone," Martha whispered, the word carrying the weight of abandonment. "All gone east or west, or just gone?" Thomas's jaw tightened with what little strength he had left. "We wrote letters, sent word with travelers heading to Helena and Missoula. Never heard back." His voice cracked. "Guess they figured we were already dead." The photograph in Martha's grip drew Zeke's attention again. Despite her weakness, she guarded it fiercely, and he realized it was probably all she had left of children who'd moved away to chase easier lives in distant cities. The image of this gentle woman clinging to memories of ungrateful offspring while slowly freezing to death stirred something, fierce and protective in his chest. Most men in his position would have offered what help they could spare and ridden on. The mountains were full of sob stories, and a wise man looked after himself first. But as Zeke studied the couple's faces, lined with decades of shared struggle, but still holding traces of the young lovers they'd once been, he found himself thinking of Sarah. She would have stayed. Without hesitation, without calculation, she would have rolled up her sleeves and gotten to work. The memory of his wife's compassionate heart made his decision for him. "Well, we're going to fix this," he said, standing and moving toward their cold fireplace. "First thing is to get some heat in here." He worked quickly, using his knife to shave tinder from dry wood he found in their nearly empty wood box. Soon, he had a small fire crackling, its warmth beginning to push back the deadly chill that had settled in the cabin like a living thing. Then he went outside to his saddlebags and returned with jerked meat. "Hardtack and dried apples, not much of a feast," he said. "But it'll get some strength back in you." As the Henleys ate with trembling hands, Zeke assessed what they would need for immediate survival. More food, certainly, and enough firewood to last until they could manage for themselves again. Warmer clothing and proper bedding. Medicine, if any, could be found in Clearwater Ridge. But first, he had to get them stable enough to survive while he made a supply run. The nearest settlement was a half-day's ride through terrain that was already treacherous with early snow and ice. If he left now, he might make it back before nightfall, but only if nothing went wrong. "I'm going down to Clearwater Ridge for supplies," he told them as color began to return to their faces. "There's enough wood here to keep the fire going until I get back. Don't let it die." Martha reached out with one thin hand and grasped his wrist. Her fingers were cold but surprisingly strong. "You don't even know us," she said, tears gathering in her faded blue eyes. "Why would you—" "Because it's the right thing to do," Zeke replied simply. The words came from some deep part of himself that he'd thought Sarah's death had killed, and because no one should have to die alone and forgotten. The ride to Clearwater Ridge became a race against time and weather. Clouds that had been building on the northern horizon all morning were beginning to show their teeth, promising snow that could trap anyone foolish enough to be caught in the open. Duchess seemed to sense the urgency, picking her way down icy trails with sure-footed determination. In town, Zeke bought supplies with money he'd been saving for his own winter needs. Flour, salt pork, beans, coffee, and other staples that would keep the Henleys fed for weeks. Warm blankets from Fletcher's General Store, medicine from Doc Morrison, who asked no questions but nodded approvingly when Zeke described the couple's condition. The return journey proved even more challenging. Snow began falling in earnest as he climbed back toward the high country, fat flakes that reduced visibility and made every step treacherous. By the time he reached the Henley cabin, his face was numb with cold, and ice had formed in his beard, but he'd made it. The supplies would see the old couple through the worst of winter, and their grateful tears were worth every frozen mile. As he built up their fire and helped Martha prepare a real meal from the provisions he'd brought, Zeke felt something inside his chest loosening, a knot of grief and isolation that had been tied tight for 3 long years. He should have ridden home then, while he still could. Should have wished them well and returned to his own cabin and his own preparations. Instead, he found himself lingering, drawn by Martha's gentle humor and Thomas's quiet wisdom. When they invited him to stay for supper, he accepted. It was only as he finally prepared to leave, stepping into the bitter night air, that Zeke realized what the day had cost him. The wind hit his left ear with a spike of pain that made him gasp. When he touched the spot, his fingers came away bloody. Frostbite had claimed the tip of his ear during the desperate ride through the storm. A small price, he told himself, as he mounted Duchess for the dark ride home. But as the wind found that tender wound again and again during the long journey back to his cabin, Zeke wondered if this act of mercy might have changed more than just the Henleys' fate. Something fundamental had shifted inside him today, and he wasn't sure he could ever go back to being the man who would have ridden past that thin column of smoke without stopping to investigate. The mountains, it seemed, still had lessons to teach him about what it meant to be truly alive. 3 days passed before Zeke returned to the Henley cabin, and in that time the weather had turned mean. Snow fell steadily, not the gentle dusting of early winter, but the serious business of a season that had arrived ahead of schedule. When he knocked on their door this time, it was Thomas himself who answered, standing upright and clear-eyed. "Ezekiel," the old man said, genuine pleasure warming his voice. Martha was just saying she hoped you'd come back soon. The transformation inside the cabin was remarkable. Where before there had been the smell of desperation, now there was the comfortable aroma of coffee and fresh bread. Martha sat at their small wooden table, her silver hair neatly braided again, her cheeks showing the first hint of healthy color. She was mending a quilt with careful, precise stitches, her movements still deliberate, but no longer weakened by starvation. "Sit yourself down," she said, gesturing to a handmade chair beside the fire. "I've got coffee hot and cornbread that's almost ready." Zeke found himself oddly reluctant to intrude on their domestic tranquility. In his cabin, meals were functional affairs, fuel to keep his body working through another day. But here, even the simple act of preparing food seemed infused with care and tradition. Martha moved around their small kitchen area with the confidence of a woman who had been making homes for decades, while Thomas whittled shavings for kindling with economical. "Practice strokes. You don't need to fuss," Zeke said, though he made no move to leave. "Nonsense," Martha replied firmly. "It's the least we can do after what you've done for us." As they settled around the table with steaming mugs and warm bread, Zeke found himself studying the cabin with new eyes. What he'd initially seen as sparse poverty now revealed itself as careful curation. Every item had been chosen for both function and meaning. A carved wooden bowl held pride of place on the mantel, clearly a wedding gift or family heirloom. Hand-sewn curtains framed the single window, their cheerful yellow fabric bringing sunlight into the room even on grey days. But it was the walking stick propped beside Thomas's chair that truly caught Zeke's attention. The staff was clearly handmade, carved from what looked like mountain ash. Along its length, scenes had been etched with loving detail, deer drinking from a stream, eagles soaring above pine forests. A small cabin, much like this one, nestled against protective rocks. The craftsmanship spoke of long winter evenings spent shaping memory into wood. "That's beautiful work," Zeke said, nodding toward the walking stick. Thomas's weathered face lit with pride. "Made it our first winter here 43 years ago. Of course, I didn't need it for walking then, just liked having something to do with my hands when the snow kept us cabin-bound." 43 years, Zeke repeated, amazed. "You've been here since before the territory was even properly mapped." "We were young and full of dreams," Martha said, settling back into her chair with her mending. "Tom had heard there was good land up here for homesteading, and I was foolish enough to think an adventure sounded romantic." Thomas chuckled, a sound that seemed to fill the cabin with warmth. Martha was the prettiest schoolteacher in Missouri. Could have married a banker or a lawyer, lived in a fine house with servants and fancy dresses. Instead, she threw her lot in with a dreamer who wanted to build something with his own hands. Never regretted it for a moment, Martha said, though her voice carried the weariness of someone who had paid dearly for her choices. We built this place log by log, stone by stone, planted our garden, raised our children, watched the seasons turn year after year. The mention of children brought a shadow across both their faces. Zeke had wondered about the family that had abandoned them, and now he found himself genuinely curious rather than merely polite. "Tell me about them," he said gently. Thomas and Martha exchanged a look that spoke of shared pain carefully carried. "3 children," Thomas said finally. 2 boys and a girl. James, our eldest, he headed to California when gold fever hit the coast. That was, 15 years ago now. Samuel went east to Chicago, said he wanted to make something of himself in business. And our daughter Rebecca, she married a man from Denver and moved there to raise her own family. They wrote for a while, Martha added, her fingers working the needle with mechanical precision. Christmas letters mostly. Sometimes word would come through travelers or mail carriers who made it this far into the territory. But the letters got fewer as the years passed, and now, she shrugged with forced lightness. "Well, I suppose they have their own lives to live." Zeke heard the hurt beneath her matter-of-fact words. He thought of his own isolation, chosen and maintained by his own grief, and wondered how it would feel to be abandoned rather than self-exiled. The Henleys had given their lives to raising children who had simply walked away when easier opportunities presented themselves. "They don't know what they're missing," he said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Martha looked up from her sewing, and for a moment, her composed mask slipped to reveal the lonely mother beneath. "You're kind to say that. But we understand, truly we do. The mountain life isn't for everyone, and young people need to find their own way in the world." "Still," Thomas said, his hands stilling on the piece of wood he'd been smoothing, "it would have been nice to know our grandchildren, to pass on some of what we learned about living up here, making do with what the land provides." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the steady whisper of snow against the windows. Zeke found himself reluctant to break the peace. In his own cabin, silence was his constant companion, but it was a hollow thing, the absence of sound rather than its restful presence. Here quiet felt full of shared understanding. "You remind me of James," Martha said suddenly, looking at Zeke with eyes that held both sadness and affection. "Not in looks, but in the way you move, the way you think before you speak. He was always observing, always trying to understand how things worked." "Practical-minded," Thomas agreed. "Good with his hands, too. Could fix most anything that broke, build what we needed from whatever materials we could find." Zeke felt a strange pang at the comparison. To be reminded of someone's absent son was both honor and burden, a role he'd never expected to fill. "What happened to him out in California?" "Last letter we got, he was working a claim somewhere near Sacramento," Thomas replied. "Said he was close to striking it rich, just needed a little more time. That was 12 years ago. The mathematics of abandonment was stark. 12 years without word, without knowing whether their son was alive or dead, successful or broken by the harsh realities of gold fever." Zeke began to understand why the Henleys had been so ready to accept death when he found them. Hope deferred for too long becomes its own kind of starvation. "Maybe the letters just got lost," he offered, though he didn't believe it himself. "Maybe," Martha agreed. But her tone suggested she had long since made peace with harder truths. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the cabin walls with increasing force. What had begun as gentle snowfall was developing into a proper storm. Zeke glanced toward the window, calculating the difficulty of returning to his own cabin in such weather. "You'd better stay the night," Thomas said, following his gaze. "That storm's got teeth, and it's no weather for traveling alone." The offer presented Zeke with an unexpected dilemma. He hadn't slept under another person's roof in 3 years, hadn't shared living space with anyone since Sarah's death. The thought of lying awake, listening to other people breathe, of navigating the small courtesies of shared space, made his skin crawl with social anxiety. But the alternative was a dangerous ride through worsening conditions, and he could see genuine concern in both their faces. They weren't offering shelter out of obligation, but from the simple human desire to keep him safe. The realization that someone cared about his welfare was both touching and terrifying. "I suppose that would be wise," he said reluctantly. "Wonderful," Martha beamed, already moving to prepare bedding. "It'll be nice to have company for an evening. Gets quiet up here when the weather turns." As the storm intensified outside and the three of them settled in for a long winter's night together, Zeke found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The Henleys' kindness was genuine but demanding. They expected him to be present, to participate in conversation and companionship. After 3 years of solitude, the prospect was both appealing and exhausting. But as Martha hummed softly while preparing their evening meal, and Thomas added another log to the fire, Zeke felt something loosening in his chest that he'd almost forgotten existed. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was part of something larger than his own survival, a small circle of warmth and care that pushed back against the mountain darkness. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping the three of them in the cabin, like kindred spirits sharing a refuge from the world's harsh judgment. On the first evening, as wind howled through the pines and snow piled against the windows, Zeke found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years, talking about Sarah. It began innocently enough. Martha had been preparing venison stew from meat Zeke had brought, moving around the small kitchen with practiced grace. Her gentle humming, the way she tested seasoning with a careful taste, the unconscious smile that played across her lips as she worked. It all reminded him so powerfully of his late wife that he felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. Not quite meaning to speak the words aloud, Martha paused, wooden spoon halfway to her mouth. "Do I? Someone pleasant, I hope. My wife, Sarah." The name felt strange on his lips after so long. She had the same way of making a simple meal feel like something special. Thomas looked up from the leather harness he was mending, his weathered hands stilling. "Had? She died 3 years ago." The words came easier than Zeke had expected. Perhaps it was the warmth of the cabin or the gentle attention in their faces, but he found himself continuing. "Childbirth. Lost the baby too. A son." The silence that followed wasn't awkward but respectful, the kind of quiet that honored grief without trying to diminish it with empty reassurances. Martha set down her spoon and moved to where Zeke sat by the fire. "I'm so sorry," she said simply, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. "That's a loss no man should have to bear." Something about her touch, maternal, unconditional, broke through defenses Zeke had spent 3 years building. To his horror, he felt tears threatening. He hadn't cried since the day he'd buried Sarah and their son on the hillside behind their farm. Hadn't allowed himself that release because it felt too much like surrender. "She would have loved this place," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Sarah always saw beauty where others saw hardship. Used to press wildflowers between the pages of her books. Said they helped her remember that even difficult seasons eventually give way to something lovely. From his saddlebag in the corner, he retrieved his leather journal. The movement felt ceremonial, like opening a sacred text. Martha and Thomas watched with respectful curiosity as he turned to a page where a pressed alpine forget-me-not lay like a blue whisper against yellowed paper. "This one's from our first summer here," he said. "Found it growing near a stream up on Glacier Pass. The blue reminded me of her eyes." Martha leaned closer to admire the delicate flower. "She sounds like a woman who understood that happiness comes from small moments, not grand gestures." "That's exactly right." Zeke carefully closed the journal, surprised by how good it felt to share this piece of Sarah with people who could appreciate its significance. She used to say that a pressed flower was better than a diamond because it held memories of a perfect day. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "What brought you up to the mountains after your loss?"
"Couldn't stay in our house."
"Couldn't stand the way neighbors looked at me, all that pity mixed with relief that tragedy had chosen my door instead of theirs. And the quiet," Zeke stared into the fire, remembering. The quiet there was different, empty, Up here, the silence has weight to it, meaning. Makes a man feel small, but not forgotten. The conversation drifted to other topics as the evening progressed, but something fundamental had shifted. By sharing Sarah's memory, Zeke had opened a door he'd kept locked for 3 years. The Henleys seemed to understand the gift he'd given them, treating his story with the reverence it deserved. The next morning brought news that complicated their growing friendship. Thomas had awakened early and managed to dig through the snow to their small cache of emergency supplies. What he found there made his face go grey. "We've got a problem," he announced as they gathered around the breakfast table. "Found tracks around our food stores. Big cat from the looks of it. Mountain lion, most likely." Zeke felt his blood chill. A hungry predator this close to winter could mean disaster for anyone living alone in the high country. How fresh were the tracks? Hard to say with all this snow, but recent enough. "And there's more." Thomas hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver worse news. "I saw smoke yesterday morning, just before the storm hit proper, coming from the direction of Clearwater Ridge." "That could mean anything," Martha said, but her voice held forced optimism. "Could," Thomas agreed. "But combined with what we've been hearing from travelers who pass through, families leaving, businesses closing, I'm wondering if we're not looking at a harder winter than most." Zeke processed this information with growing unease. A struggling town, dangerous wildlife pushed down from higher elevations by early snow, and weather that showed no signs of improving. It painted a picture of a season that could test everyone's ability to survive. "The mountain lion worries me most," he said. "Desperate predator makes for dangerous neighbors, especially if there are other families scattered around these valleys." "There are," Thomas confirmed. "The Murphy place is about 5 miles north of here. Old Sean Murphy lives alone since his wife passed. And there's a family with young children, the Jacobsons, maybe 8 miles southeast. They came up here 2 summers ago, thinking they could make a go of farming." The weight of responsibility settled on Zeke's shoulders like a familiar burden. These weren't just random strangers anymore. They were people he'd begun to care about, however reluctantly. The thought of families with children facing a mountain lion, a harsh winter, and dwindling supplies made his stomach clench with protective instinct. "We should check on them," he heard himself saying. "When this storm clears, make sure everyone's prepared for what's coming." Martha looked up from her sewing with surprise and approval. "That's very thoughtful of you, Ezekiel." But Thomas was studying him with sharper eyes, the gaze of a man who'd learned to read character through decades of frontier living. "You're not thinking like a man who plans to winter alone in his cabin," he observed. The old man's words hit closer to truth than Zeke was comfortable acknowledging. Somewhere during these 2 days of shared meals and conversation, his perspective had begun to shift. The isolation that had once felt like necessary protection now seemed selfish, even cowardly. Sarah's memory, instead of driving him toward solitude, was pushing him back toward the connections that made life meaningful. "Maybe I'm not," he admitted, the words feeling strange, but right. Maybe there's more than one way to honor the dead. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the warm cabin, 3 people sat in companionable silence, each contemplating how one act of mercy had started ripples that might reach farther than any of them could imagine. The storm would end eventually, and when it did, Ezekiel Brant would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be for whatever challenges lay ahead. The mountains, it seemed, still had lessons to teach about the difference between existing and truly living. The storm cleared on the 3rd day, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the valleys, and twice that where the wind had carved it into drifts. The sky burned brilliant blue above peaks that gleamed like polished silver, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. When Zeke finally saddled Duchess for the ride into Clearwater Ridge, every breath felt sharp enough to cut glass. The trail down from the Henley cabin proved treacherous, forcing him to dismount repeatedly and lead his horse around fallen trees and washed-out sections where spring snowmelt had carved new channels. What should have been a 2-hour journey stretched into 4, and by the time he reached the outskirts of town, The sun was already sliding toward the western peaks. Clearwater Ridge looked like a settlement under siege. Main Street, usually bustling with modest activity, lay nearly empty except for a few hardy souls hurrying between buildings with their heads down against the wind. Many of the windows that had been lit during his previous visits now stared dark and vacant. The hotel that had once offered rooms to traveling miners and merchants displayed a crude sign that read, "Closed, try Helena." At Fletcher's General Store, Zeke found Sam behind the counter tallying columns of numbers, with the grim expression of a man watching his life's work dissolve into red ink. The older man looked up when the door's bell jangled, his weathered face brightening momentarily before settling back into worried lines. "Zeke, good to see you made it through that blow." Beginning to wonder if anyone would, Sam set down his pencil and moved around the counter. "You need supplies, or are you here about something else?" "Something else," Zeke admitted. "Heard there might be folks in trouble up in the valleys. Thought I'd check on what's happening down here first." Sam's laugh held no humor. "What's happening is we're dying by degrees. Lost 3 more families just this week. The Andersons packed up for Oregon, the Clarks headed back to Missouri, and young Pete Williams just gave up on his claim and rode out yesterday morning." The store owner moved to the front window and gestured at the nearly empty street. "Look around. Half these buildings are empty now. Doc Morrison's talking about closing his practice and heading to Billings, where there's actually people to doctor. Even the preacher's making noises about finding a congregation that can pay him something more than potatoes and good intentions." Zeke absorbed this information with growing unease. "What about the families still up in the high country? The Murphys, the Jacobsons? Haven't seen hide nor hair of Sean Murphy since before the storm. Could be fine, could be—" Sam shrugged helplessly. "As for the Jacobsons, last I heard they were planning to tough it out another winter, but that was before this weather hit. Family with 3 young children. They'd be crazy to stay, but they ain't got money to leave." The picture Sam painted was bleaker than Zeke had imagined. Not just individual hardship, but the slow collapse of an entire community. People weren't just struggling with winter, they were giving up on the dream that had brought them west in the first place. "There's something else," Sam continued, lowering his voice. "Been hearing stories from trappers and hunters passing through. Talk of a big cat stalking the valleys north of here. Mountain lion most likely, but bigger than usual. Killed a man's horse up near Copper Creek, came right into his camp bold as brass." The news confirmed Thomas's fears and added urgency to Zeke's growing sense of responsibility. A predator that bold was one that had learned not to fear humans, a dangerous development for anyone living alone in remote cabins. "I need to check on those families," Zeke said, more to himself than to Sam. The store owner studied him with curious eyes. "That's decent of you, but what's brought on this sudden interest in community welfare? Last few times you've been in town, you could barely wait to get back to your mountain." It was a fair question, and one Zeke wasn't sure he could answer completely. The truth was complex, part Sarah's influence, part the Henleys' gentle humanity, and part his own growing realization that isolation wasn't the same as healing. "Maybe I'm tired of living like a ghost," he said finally. Sam nodded slowly, as if the answer made sense to him in ways that went beyond words. "Well, if you're serious about checking on folks, you should know that the town's been talking. Some say we ought to organize, pool resources, help each other through the worst of it. Others figure it's every man for himself now. What do you think?" "I think we're stronger together than apart, but I also think people are scared enough to make some poor decisions." Sam moved back behind his counter and pulled out a hand-drawn map. "This shows where most of the remaining families are holed up. Murphy's place here, the Jacobsons there. There's also old Henrik Olsen, about 12 miles up Willow Creek, Norwegian fellow. Came here to get away from people, but he's pushing 70 and might not make it through a hard winter alone." Zeke studied the map, calculating distances and travel times. Even with favorable weather, visiting all these scattered homesteads would take days, and winter was just beginning. There would be months of storms ahead, each one potentially fatal for anyone caught unprepared. "I'll need supplies," he said. "Food, medicine, blankets, things I can distribute to folks who need them." Sam's eyebrows rose. "That's going to cost considerable money. I've got pelts. Should be enough to cover what's needed." For the next hour, they worked together to assemble packages of essential supplies. Flour, salt pork, coffee, and other non-perishables that could sustain a family through extended isolation. Warm blankets, basic medical supplies, lamp oil for the long, dark nights ahead. By the time they finished, Duchess would be carrying nearly her limit, but the load represented hope for people who might otherwise face death alone. As Zeke prepared to leave, Sam caught his arm. "You sure about this? What you're proposing? Riding through this country in winter, checking on scattered families, that's dangerous work. One bad storm could trap you miles from shelter." "Someone has to do it," Zeke replied. "And I've got the skills to survive out there." "That's not what I'm asking, and you know it." Sam's grip tightened slightly. "I'm asking if you're ready to care about people again. Because once you start down that road, it's hard to turn back. These folks start depending on you, and suddenly their troubles become your troubles." The warning was wise, and part of Zeke wanted to heed it. Caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss. He'd spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of emotional entanglement, but he thought of Martha's gentle strength, of Thomas's quiet dignity, of children he'd never met who might be shivering in inadequate shelters, while their parents wondered how to keep them alive until spring. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. "I'm ready," he said. Sam released his arm and stepped back with something that might have been respect. "Then God go with you, and Zeke, if you find folks in real trouble, bring them back here. Town may be dying, but we've still got roofs and fireplaces. Better to crowd together than freeze apart." As Zeke rode out of Clearwater Ridge with his precious cargo of supplies, he felt the weight of more than physical burden on his shoulders. Somewhere in the snow-covered valleys ahead, people were making their own calculations about survival and surrender. His job was to make sure they had better choices available when the time came to decide. The Murphy place sat in a depression between 2 ridges, positioned to catch morning sun while remaining sheltered from the worst winds. As Zeke approached the modest cabin, he noticed smoke rising steadily from the chimney, a good sign, but the silence troubled him. No dog barked an alert, no voice called out a greeting, and the snow around the cabin showed only the tracks of one man moving between woodpile and door. Sean Murphy answered Zeke's knock with a shotgun in his weathered hands, though he lowered it quickly upon recognizing his visitor. The old Irishman had aged considerably since Zeke's last glimpse of him in town. His red hair had gone completely grey, and his green eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd been alone too long with his thoughts. "Brant," Murphy said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Didn't expect to see another soul until spring. What brings you out in weather like this?" The cabin's interior reflected both careful maintenance and profound loneliness. Everything was clean and in its proper place, but there was no warmth beyond what the fire provided. No personal touches, no signs that anyone found joy in living here. It felt more like a survival station than a home. "Checking on folks after that storm," Zeke explained. "Making sure everyone has what they need to get through winter." Murphy's laugh was bitter. "What I need is my Margaret back, but I don't suppose you're carrying miracles in those saddlebags." The mention of his late wife, dead 2 years now from consumption, hung heavy in the air. Zeke recognized the particular quality of grief that came from losing a partner after decades together. It was different from his own loss, but equally devastating in its completeness. "No miracles," Zeke admitted. "But I've got supplies. Food, blankets, lamp oil, things that might make the dark months easier." For the next hour, they worked together to unload and organize the provisions Zeke had brought. Murphy accepted the help with grudging gratitude, his pride warring with practical necessity. As they worked, he shared news that made Zeke's chest tighten with concern. "Saw that cat you've probably heard about," Murphy said, stacking cans of food with mechanical precision. "Big mountain lion, bold as brass. Came right up to my cabin 3 nights ago, bold enough to leave paw prints on my porch." had to fire a shot over its head to make it back off. The predator was becoming more aggressive, which meant hungrier and more desperate. Winter always pushed wildlife to extremes, but this seemed beyond normal behavior. Anyone else seen it? Don't know. Haven't talked to another soul in weeks. Murphy's isolation was clearly wearing on him. Used to be, neighbors would check on each other regular. Now everyone's so busy just surviving, there's no time for community. It was exactly the kind of breakdown Zeke had feared. When people stopped caring for each other, individual struggles became community disasters. The fabric that held frontier settlements together was fragile at best, and harsh winters had a way of fraying it beyond repair. From Murphy's cabin, Zeke rode southeast toward the Jacobson place, following deer trails through timber so thick with snow that progress was measured in yards rather than miles. The temperature had dropped with the setting sun, and his breath formed ice crystals that clung to his beard. Duchess struggled through drifts that sometimes reached her belly, but the sturdy mare pressed on with the determination of an animal that understood the stakes. The Jacobson cabin appeared through the trees just as full darkness settled over the mountains. Light glowed warmly through frost-covered windows, and smoke rose from the chimney in reassuring volume. But what struck Zeke most powerfully was the sound that greeted him. Children's laughter echoing across the snow-covered clearing. Peter Jacobson emerged from the cabin at the sound of approaching hooves. Rifle ready but not threatening. He was a man in his 30s, lean from hard work, but not yet worn down by mountain life. Behind him in the doorway appeared his wife Anna, a young woman with intelligent eyes and prematurely calloused hands. 3 children peered around their parents' legs, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 10. "Mr. Brant," Peter said with genuine pleasure, "what brings you out on a night like this?" The family welcomed him inside with warmth that reminded Zeke powerfully of what he'd lost. Their cabin was small, but filled with the kind of creative energy that came from people determined to build something meaningful together. Hand-sewn quilts covered rough furniture, and children's drawings decorated the walls. Anna had somehow managed to create beauty from the simplest materials. It was the quilt squares scattered around Anna's sewing basket that caught Zeke's attention. Each piece was different, some geometric patterns in bright colors, others featuring appliqued flowers or animals. They were clearly meant to be assembled into a larger work, but they remained separate, unfinished. "Community quilt," Anna explained, noticing his interest. "Each family in the valley was supposed to contribute squares, then we'd piece them together for the church. But with so many people leaving," she gestured helplessly at the lonely fragments. The unfinished quilt squares became a perfect metaphor for what was happening to their small community. Individual pieces of beauty and craftsmanship, but no longer connected into something larger and stronger. The bonds that should have held them together had been broken by fear, isolation, and the simple struggle to survive. Young Emma Jacobson, perhaps 7 years old, approached Zeke with the fearless curiosity of childhood. She had her mother's intelligent eyes and her father's determined chin. "Are you really a mountain man?" she asked. "Papa says you live all alone up in the high places." The question hit Zeke harder than expected. How did you explain to a child that sometimes people chose solitude because connection hurt too much? That some wounds took years to heal, if they ever did? "I do live alone," he said carefully. "But lately I've been thinking that might not be the best way to live." Emma nodded seriously, as if his answer made perfect sense. "Mama says people need other people, like flowers need sunshine. Even the tough mountain flowers that grow in rocks." The child's wisdom, delivered with such innocent certainty, made Zeke's throat tighten. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults spent years learning. Over dinner, a simple but nourishing meal of venison stew and cornbread, Zeke shared what he'd learned about the community's struggles. The Jacobsons listened with growing concern as he described families leaving, businesses closing, and the general breakdown of mutual support that had once characterized frontier life. "We've talked about leaving," Peter admitted. "Anna's got family back in Ohio who'd take us in. But this land, this life we're building, it feels like giving up on something important. It is important, Zeke found himself saying. What you're doing here, raising children who understand that happiness comes from simple things. Teaching them to find beauty in difficult places. That's exactly what the world needs more of. His words surprised him with their conviction. When had he become someone who encouraged others to stay and fight instead of running from hardship? But looking at this family, their love for each other, their determination to create something meaningful in the wilderness, he felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. Later that evening, as the children slept and the adults lingered around the fire, Anna showed him the individual quilt squares more closely. Each one told a story. The Murphy square featured shamrocks and Celtic knots, while another displayed the careful German craftsmanship of a family that had already moved on. "I keep hoping someone will finish it," she said wistfully. "Seems wrong to let all this work go to waste." "Maybe someone will," Zeke said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. As he prepared to leave the next morning, young Emma approached with something clutched in her small hands. "For you," she said, offering him a pressed flower, a alpine forget-me-not that she'd somehow preserved from the previous summer. "Mama helped me press it. She said you might understand what it means." The gesture was so reminiscent of Sarah's flower pressing that Zeke felt his carefully maintained composure crack. This child, who barely knew him, had somehow understood that he carried grief and was offering the same medicine his wife had once provided, beauty preserved against loss, hope pressed between the pages of memory. "Thank you," he managed, accepting the delicate gift with hands that shook slightly. "I'll treasure it." As he rode away from the Jacobson cabin, Zeke realized that his mission to check on scattered families had become something larger. He wasn't just distributing supplies anymore, he was gathering the scattered threads of community, trying to weave them back together before winter's isolation made the task impossible. The discovery came by accident. As the most life-changing revelations often do, Zeke had returned to the Henley cabin after 3 days of checking on scattered families, his saddlebags lighter of supplies, but his mind heavier with the weight of community responsibility. He found Thomas splitting firewood behind the cabin with methodical precision, each swing of the axe landing exactly where intended, despite the old man's apparent frailty. What caught Zeke's attention wasn't Thomas's surprising vigor, mountain. Life kept men strong well past their expected prime, but something that had fallen from the old man's coat pocket. A piece of paper, yellowed with age, lay half-buried in wood chips and snow. Zeke bent to retrieve it, intending simply to return lost property. The document that unfolded in his hands changed everything he thought he knew about Thomas Henley. "Honorable discharge. United States Army," the formal text began. "Sergeant Thomas Andrew Henley, 2nd Regiment, Colorado Volunteer Infantry." But it was the details that followed that made Zeke's breath catch in the thin mountain air. "Distinguished service at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. Commendation for gallantry under fire. Leadership of men in extreme circumstances resulting in preservation of unit and civilian lives." The paper was signed by a colonel whose name Zeke recognized from history books, one of the Union's most respected commanders in the Western theater. At the bottom, in faded ink, someone had written a personal note. "Tom saved 43 men that day. We owe our lives to his quick thinking and courage under impossible odds." Zeke read the document twice, struggling to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man he'd come to know with the decorated war hero, described in official language. Thomas Henley wasn't just a retired schoolteacher who'd chosen mountain life. He was a proven leader who had commanded men in life-and-death situations. Finding something interesting in my woodpile. Zeke turned to see Thomas watching him with calm eyes that held no shame, only a weary recognition that his secret was finally out. The old man set down his axe and brushed wood chips from his hands with the same methodical care he applied to everything. "You dropped this," Zeke said, holding out the discharge paper. Thomas took the document and folded it carefully before tucking it back into his coat pocket. Figured that might happen eventually. Martha keeps telling me to throw the damn thing away, but he shrugged. Some things are hard to let go of, even when they're more burden than blessing. Glorieta Pass, Zeke said quietly. That was the battle that saved Colorado Territory for the Union, turned back the Confederate, advanced and protected the goldfields. You know your history. Thomas's voice carried neither pride nor regret, just acknowledgement of facts. Most folks out here never heard of it. Just another skirmish in a war that had too many of them. They stood in silence for a moment, two men processing the shift in their relationship. Zeke found himself reassessing every interaction they'd had, every piece of advice Thomas had offered, every moment of quiet wisdom that had seemed to come from simple, frontier experience. "Why didn't you tell me?" Zeke asked finally. Thomas resumed splitting wood, but his movements had taken on a different quality, more deliberate, more controlled. Because men don't want to hear war stories from old soldiers. They want to believe that violence and leadership are things that happen to other people in other times. Besides, that was 25 years ago. I'm not that man anymore. But even as he spoke, Zeke could see that wasn't entirely true. The precision with which Thomas swung the axe, the way he automatically positioned himself to watch both the trail and the cabins simultaneously, the quiet authority that made people instinctively trust his judgment. These weren't traits that disappeared with age. Martha knows. Obviously, Martha knows everything worth knowing about me, including things I'd rather forget. Thomas paused in his work. She was a nurse during the war, you know. We met in a field hospital outside Denver. I was there with a minor wound, and she was there saving men who weren't as lucky. Another revelation that reshaped Zeke's understanding of the woman who had welcomed him with such gentle grace. Martha wasn't just a retired schoolteacher. She was someone who had seen the worst of human suffering and chosen to respond with compassion rather than cynicism. "The two of you have been watching me," Zeke said, the realization dawning gradually. "Evaluating me." Thomas's laugh was dry but not unkind. "Son, Martha spotted your potential the day you hauled us half dead from our cabin. She's got an eye for character that 20 years of battlefield experience taught me to trust absolutely." "What kind of potential?" "The kind that takes a man living alone by choice and turns him into someone who rides through blizzards to check on people he barely knows." Thomas split another log with particular force. "The kind that makes natural leaders, whether they want the responsibility or not." The weight of understanding settled on Zeke's shoulders like a physical burden. The Henleys hadn't been passive recipients of his charity. They'd been deliberately nurturing something they'd recognized in him from the beginning. Their gentle encouragement, their stories about community and connection, even their willingness to share their own vulnerabilities, all of it had been designed to draw him back into the world of human responsibility. "You've been manipulating me. We've been hoping for you." Martha's voice came from behind them, soft but firm. She stood in the cabin doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her eyes holding the same calm acceptance as her husband's. "There's a difference, though I understand why it might not feel that way." Zeke turned to face her, his mind reeling with implications. "And how long have you been planning this?" "Since the moment you chose to help instead of riding past." Martha stepped closer, her weathered hands folded in front of her. "We've lived in these mountains for 43 years, Ezekiel. We've seen communities form and fall apart, watched good people give up when they might have survived with proper leadership. We know what it takes to hold people together when times get hard, and you think I have those qualities. I know you do." Thomas's voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had led soldiers through impossible circumstances. "I've watched you work, seen how you think through problems, noticed the way people respond to your presence. You have the instincts of a natural commander, even if you don't recognize them yourself." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. All three of them turned toward the trail, where a rider was emerging from the tree line at dangerous speed. As the figure drew closer, Zeke recognized young Billy Fletcher, Sam's eldest son. bent low over his horse's neck with the urgency of someone carrying desperate news. The boy pulled up in a spray of snow and ice, his face red with cold and exertion. "Mr. Brant, thank God I found you. Pa sent me to fetch you quick as I could ride. What's wrong?" Zeke demanded, already moving toward Duchess. "That mountain lion. It attacked the Olsen place. Old Henrik's barricaded in his cabin, but the cat's got him trapped. Been circling the place for 2 days, waiting for him to come out." Billy's words tumbled over each other in his haste. "Pa says we need someone who knows how to handle dangerous animals, and you're the only real mountain man left in the territory." The news hit Zeke like a physical blow. Henrik Olsen was 70 years old, living alone in a cabin miles from the nearest neighbor. Even if he had adequate food and fuel, the psychological pressure of being hunted by a predator could break a man's spirit long before his body gave out. "How far?" Zeke asked, already checking his rifle and gathering supplies. 12 miles up Willow Creek, trails mostly clear, but there's places where the snow's deep enough to trap a horse. Billy's young face was tight with fear. "Mr. Brant, Pa says this ain't a normal cat. Says it's bigger than any mountain lion he's ever heard tell of, and smart enough to know when it's got someone cornered." Thomas stepped forward, and for the first time since Zeke had known him, the old man carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. "You'll need help with this. A smart predator isn't something one man should face alone." "You're 70 years old," Zeke protested, "and I've killed more dangerous things than mountain lions." Thomas's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who knew exactly what violence looked like. "Besides, this is exactly the kind of situation where experience matters more than youth. That cat has Henrik thinking like prey instead of like a man. It'll take more than good shooting to solve this problem." Martha moved to her husband's side, her face pale but determined. "Tom's right, and if Henrik's hurt, he'll need someone who knows field medicine." "I'm coming too." "Absolutely not. Ezekiel Brant, don't you dare try to protect me from the consequences of doing what's right." Martha's voice carried the steel of a woman who had treated wounded soldiers in wartime. "That old man is going to need all the help he can get, and I've got skills that might mean the difference between bringing him home alive or bringing him home in a box." As they prepared for what might be the most dangerous rescue any of them had ever attempted, Zeke realized that everything had changed. He was no longer a solitary mountain man, grudgingly helping his neighbors. He was part of a team, working with people whose hidden strengths and shared purpose had transformed them all into something greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. The mountains were about to test not just their survival skills, but their willingness to risk everything for someone who couldn't save himself. And for the first time in 3 years, Zeke felt ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. The ride toward Henrik Olsen's cabin through Willow Creek Valley tested every skill Zeke had learned in 3 years of mountain living. Snow lay deep enough to swallow a horse's legs, and the narrow trail wound between granite outcrops that could hide predators or avalanche danger. But it was the weight of responsibility that pressed, heaviest on his shoulders as he led their small rescue party through terrain that grew more treacherous. With each passing hour, Thomas rode behind him with the rigid posture of a cavalry officer, every movement economical and purposeful. The revelation of his military background had transformed him from kindly old man into something harder and more dangerous, a leader who understood that successful missions required clear thinking and absolute commitment to the objective. Martha followed on a sturdy mountain pony, her medical bag secured carefully in her saddlebags. Her face set with the determined calm of someone who had seen battlefield surgery and would not flinch from whatever horrors awaited them. Young Billy Fletcher had insisted on coming despite Zeke's protests, arguing that they needed someone who could ride back to town for additional help if things went badly. The boy's courage was admirable, but Zeke worried about exposing someone so young to the kind of violence that awaited them at Olsen's cabin. As they climbed higher into the valley, Thomas began sharing tactical knowledge that made their desperate mission feel more like a military operation. Smart predator like this one will have established patterns, he explained, his voice carrying easily through the thin air. It'll know the approaches to the cabin, the best ambush points, the escape routes if threatened. Our advantage is that it's thinking like a hunter, not like prey. It won't expect organized resistance. What do you think we're dealing with exactly? Zeke asked, trusting the old soldier's experience with dangerous situations. Based on what Billy described, probably a male mountain lion driven down from higher elevations by early snow. Big cats this aggressive are usually either wounded, sick, or displaced from their normal territory. Thomas's analysis was clinical but reassuring in its competence. The fact that it's maintaining a siege instead of giving up and moving on suggests intelligence and patience. That makes it more dangerous, but also more predictable. Martha added her own concerns from a medical perspective. Hendrik's been trapped for 2 days without adequate food or sleep. Even if he's physically unharmed, the psychological stress could be affecting his judgment. We need to be prepared for someone who might not respond rationally to rescue attempts. The truth of her words became apparent as they approached Olsen's homestead. The Norwegian's cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense pine forest, defensible terrain under normal circumstances, but now transformed into a prison by the presence of an intelligent predator. Smoke rose from the chimney in thin, irregular puffs that spoke of carefully rationed fuel, and the windows had been barricaded with whatever furniture Henrik could move against them. But it was the tracks in the snow that told the real story. The mountain lion had indeed established a pattern of surveillance, circling the cabin at regular intervals, testing for weaknesses, waiting for its prey to make a fatal mistake. The prints were larger than any Zeke had ever seen, easily 6 inches across, with claw marks that bit deep into frozen earth. Jesus, Billy whispered, staring at the evidence of the cat's presence. That thing's as big as a small bear. Thomas dismounted and studied the tracks with professional interest. Displaced male, probably 8 or 9 years old. Prime condition, which means it's not desperate enough yet to take unnecessary risks. But it's also not going to give up easily. From inside the cabin came a faint voice, hoarse with exhaustion. "Who's there?" "Stay back! That devil's somewhere close!" "Henrik, it's Ezekiel Brant," Zeke called out, positioning himself where he could watch the tree line while speaking. "I've got help with me. We're going to get you out of there." The relief in the old Norwegian's voice was painful to hear. "Brant! Thank God. I thought I was going to die in here like a trapped rat." "Not today," Zeke replied with more confidence than he felt. "But we need to know where the cat is before we can move." "When did you last see it?" "Maybe an hour ago. Came right up to the door, scratching and testing. Smart as the devil himself, that one. Knows I can't stay in here forever." Thomas had completed his tactical assessment of the clearing and rejoined their group with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The cat's using the forest for cover, which means it can attack from multiple directions, but also limits its mobility once committed. We're going to force it to choose between targets and then eliminate it when it exposes itself. The plan Thomas outlined was simple but dangerous. Zeke would approach the cabin from the front, making himself visible and drawing the predator's attention. Thomas would circle around through the trees to establish a crossfire position, while Martha and Billy remained with the horses at maximum range, ready to provide covering fire or escape if things went wrong. "The key is patience," Thomas emphasized. "That cat's been hunting Henrik for 2 days. It's confident, maybe even a little overconfident. We use that against it." As they prepared to execute their plan, Martha approached Zeke with something clutched in her weathered hands. It was a single candle, slightly yellowed with age, but still whole. "This was blessed by Father Mackenzie before he left for Helena," she said, pressing it into Zeke's palm. "Probably silly superstition, but it's not silly," Zeke interrupted, understanding the significance of her gift. In a place where churches were rare and ministers even rarer, a blessed candle represented community faith and shared hope. It was Martha's way of saying that their mission had divine blessing as well as human purpose. The candle went into his coat pocket, where it rested against his heart like a talisman. Strange how something so small could carry such weight of meaning. But then, Zeke was learning that the most powerful forces in human life often came in the humblest packages. "Time to move," Thomas said, checking his rifle one final time. "Remember, this isn't about heroics. It's about bringing everyone home alive." Zeke began his approach to the cabin with deliberate slowness, making enough noise to announce his presence while keeping his rifle ready for instant use. The snow crunched under his boots with sounds that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains, and his breath formed clouds that could be seen from a considerable distance. If the mountain lion was watching, and Thomas was certain it would be, Zeke was presenting himself as an irresistible target. The silence that surrounded him felt different from the usual mountain quiet. This was the hush of a predator calculating its odds, weighing the threat represented by armed humans against the opportunity to secure prey that had been tantalizingly close for 2 days. Somewhere in the trees, yellow eyes were watching, muscles were tensing, and an ancient intelligence was making decisions that would determine who lived and who died in the next few minutes. "Henrik," Zeke called softly as he reached the cabin's front wall. "I'm going to get you out, but I need you to stay calm and follow instructions exactly." "Can you do that?" "Yes," came the muffled reply. "God, yes, anything you say." "Good. When I tell you, I want you to open the door just wide enough for us to see each other. Don't step outside yet. Just let me know you're ready to move when the time comes." As Zeke positioned himself beside the cabin door, he felt the familiar heightening of awareness that came in moments of extreme danger. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially significant. The weight of the blessed candle in his pocket reminded him that this wasn't just about individual survival. It was about proving that community and cooperation could triumph over the isolation and fear that had been slowly killing their mountain settlement. In the trees behind him, Thomas was moving into position with the silent efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before. Martha and Billy waited at their assigned distance, ready to provide support or escape as circumstances demanded. Henrik Olsen crouched behind his barricaded door, clinging to hope that rescue was finally at hand. And somewhere in the surrounding forest, a predator that had dominated this valley for days was about to discover that prey could become hunters when they worked together with intelligence, courage, and absolute commitment to protecting their own. The mountain lion's reign of terror was about to end, one way or another. The only question was what price would be paid for that victory, and whether Ezekiel Brant was truly ready to accept the responsibilities that came with leading others into mortal danger. The blessed candle seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest as he raised his rifle and prepared to face whatever emerged. From the deadly silence of the pine forest, the attack came from the direction Zeke least expected, not from the dense forest where logic suggested a predator would hide, but from above, where the mountain lion had somehow gained access to the cabin's low-pitched roof. The first sign of danger was a soft scraping sound, like claws finding purchase on wooden shingles, followed by the creak of timber under considerable weight. Zeke spun toward the sound just as the massive cat launched itself from the roof edge, its powerful body uncoiling like a spring released. In that frozen moment between heartbeats, he saw every detail with crystalline clarity. Golden fur rippling over corded muscle, yellow eyes fixed on him with predatory intelligence, claws extended like curved daggers designed by nature for killing. Time seemed to stretch as Zeke brought his rifle up, knowing even as he did that the cat was moving too fast, covering too much distance in too little time. The mountain lion struck him with the force of an avalanche, driving him backward into the snow while claws raked across his heavy coat. Only the thick wool and leather prevented the strike from opening his chest like a gutted deer. They rolled together through the snow, Zeke fighting desperately to keep the cat's jaws away from his throat while trying to bring his rifle to bear. The predator's breath was hot against his face, rank with the smell of old kills, and its weight pressed down on him like a living boulder. He could hear Henrik shouting from inside the cabin, could hear Thomas crashing through the underbrush as he rushed toward the sounds of combat. But those sounds seemed to come from another world. In this moment, there was only the elemental struggle between man and beast, civilization and wilderness, the desire to live, fighting against nature's oldest law. Zeke managed to get his rifle barrel against the cat's ribs and pulled the trigger. The report was muffled by flesh and fur, but the bullet's impact drove the mountain lion backward with a roar that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Blood darkened the snow where they had fought, some of it the cat's, but too much of it his own. The wounded predator circled him now with limping gait but undiminished fury. The bullet had struck its shoulder, disabling one front leg, but failing to deliver a killing blow. If anything, the wound had made it more dangerous, a cornered predator with nothing left to lose. Thomas's voice cut through the mountain air with military precision. "Zeke, get clear. I have the shot." But before Zeke could move, the cat charged again, this time with the desperate ferocity of an animal that knew it was dying. Zeke threw himself sideways, feeling claws rake along his ribs as he rolled away from those snapping jaws. The mountain lion's momentum carried it past him, and for a crucial second, it was exposed and motionless as it tried to change direction on 3 functional legs. Thomas's rifle spoke with the authority of long experience. The bullet took the predator high in the chest, driving through muscle and bone to find its heart. The great cat collapsed into the snow with a final, shuddering breath, its yellow eyes already glazing with death. Silence returned to the clearing, like a benediction, broken only by the sound of labored breathing and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Zeke lay in the trampled snow, blood seeping through his torn coat, but alive and conscious. Thomas emerged from the tree line with smoking rifle, his weathered face grim with the satisfaction of a job completed successfully. From his coat pocket, something pressed against Zeke's ribs, Martha's blessed candle, somehow unbroken despite the violence of the struggle. The small miracle felt significant, as if divine protection had indeed watched over their desperate mission. "Henrik," Zeke called weakly, struggling to sit up in the snow. "You can come out now." "It's over." The cabin door opened slowly, revealing the Norwegian's bearded face, eyes wide with disbelief and overwhelming relief. Henrik Olsen looked like a man who had stared death in the face for 3 days and somehow lived to tell the tale. His hair was wild, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them, but he was whole and unharmed. "You killed it," Henrik whispered, staring at the mountain lion's massive form. "You actually killed the devil." Thomas knelt beside Zeke, examining his wounds with practiced efficiency. Scratches mostly, but deep ones. "You'll need Martha's attention, and soon." He looked up at the old Norwegian. "Henrik, can you travel? We need to get everyone back to town while there's still daylight." As Martha and Billy arrived with the horses, leading Henrik's own mount that they had retrieved from his shelter, the full scope of what they had accomplished began to sink in. They had faced down a predator that had terrorized the valley for days, rescued a man who would certainly have died alone, and proven that cooperation could triumph over the isolation that had been slowly killing their community. But more than that, they had transformed themselves in the process. Zeke was no longer the broken man who had fled to the mountains after losing his wife. He was someone willing to risk everything for others. A leader who could inspire people to work together against impossible odds. The mountain lion was dead, but the real victory lay in what its death represented: the rebirth of community spirit, the power of shared purpose, and the truth that no one had to face life's challenges alone. The ride back toward Clearwater Ridge became a journey of transformation that went far beyond simple geography. Henrik Olsen, freed from his 3-day ordeal, rode between Thomas and Martha like a man discovering life again after accepting death. But it was the conversation that developed during those hours in the saddle that truly marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "I gave up," Henrik said suddenly. his voice carrying the weight of confession. "Yesterday morning, when I heard that thing on my roof, I just sat down in my chair and waited to die. Figured it was better than fighting something I couldn't beat." Thomas guided his horse around a fallen tree before responding. Every soldier faces that moment. The difference between survivors and casualties isn't courage. It's having someone worth fighting for. "I didn't have anyone," Henrik admitted. "Wife's been dead 10 years. Children scattered to the winds. Seemed easier to just let go." "You do now," Zeke said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We all do." "What happened back there? That wasn't just about killing a dangerous animal. It was about proving that we don't have to face things alone anymore." As they descended from the high country, word of their mission began to spread through the scattered community with the mysterious speed of mountain communication. Smoke signals rose from distant cabins, not distress calls, but messages of acknowledgement and hope. By the time they reached the outskirts of Clearwater Ridge, people were waiting for them. Sam Fletcher stood outside his general store with Doc Morrison and several other townspeople, their faces showing a mixture of relief and something that looked remarkably like pride. Young Emma Jacobson was there too, having ridden down from her family's cabin with her parents specifically to witness their return. "Is it true?" Sam called out as they approached. "You really killed that cat?" "We killed it," Zeke emphasized, dismounting carefully to avoid aggravating his wounds. "All of us working together. Hendrik would be dead if Thomas hadn't provided tactical guidance, if Martha hadn't been ready with medical supplies, if Billy hadn't ridden to get help. The distinction wasn't lost on the people gathered in the street." For months, they had been thinking of themselves as isolated individuals, struggling against impossible odds. What Zeke was describing was something entirely different. A community that took care of its own, that pooled resources and skills to face challenges no one could handle alone. Martha had opened her medical bag and was examining Zeke's wounds with professional competence, her gentle hands sure and steady, despite the cold. "These need proper cleaning and stitching," she announced. "Nothing that won't heal, but he's lost enough blood to make him dizzy." As she worked, applying salve to the deepest scratches and bandaging the worst of the damage, Martha began sharing something that surprised everyone present. Her medical bag contained supplies that went far beyond basic frontier medicine: surgical instruments, medications, even a small field surgery kit that spoke of serious training and experience. "Field hospital outside Denver," she explained, noticing their curious stares. "Treated everything from bullet wounds to amputations during the war. Lost a lot of good men, but saved more than I lost. Medicine's like riding a horse. You don't forget, even after 25 years. Doc Morrison, who had been practicing frontier medicine for a decade, examined her work with obvious admiration. "You could set up practice here if you wanted. God knows we need another qualified medical person." The suggestion hung in the air like a promise of things to come. Martha and Thomas exchanged the kind of look that passed between people who had shared a lifetime of decisions. And Zeke saw something spark between them, the possibility of purpose beyond mere survival. But it was Henrik Olsen who voiced what everyone was thinking. "What you folks did today, coming after me when you didn't have to, risking your own lives for someone who was ready to give up, that's the kind of thing that builds communities. Real communities, not just collections of people trying to survive in the same general area." Young Emma stepped forward, her small face serious with the gravity of what she was about to say. "Mama's been working on something," she announced. "Something she thinks might help bring everyone together." Anna Jacobson approached with a bundle in her arms, her cheeks red from cold and excitement. When she unfolded the fabric, it revealed a quilt unlike anything Zeke had ever seen. The individual squares that had been scattered around her sewing basket were now joined together in a pattern that told the story of their community: the Murphy shamrocks, the German craftsmanship, the Norwegian woodworking designs, all united by threads of gold and blue. "I finished it last night," Anna said, her voice bright with accomplishment. "Seemed like the right time to put all the pieces together." The completed quilt was more than just a work of art. It was a symbol of what they had all discovered during the crisis with the mountain lion. Individual skills and strengths, when woven together with trust and shared purpose, created something far more beautiful and valuable than the sum of its parts. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered town in shades of gold and rose, the people of Clearwater Ridge found themselves standing closer together than they had in months. The fear that had been driving them apart was being replaced by something stronger, the knowledge that they could face any challenge as long as they faced it together. The mountain lion was dead, but more importantly, their community was finally, truly alive. Spring came early to the Montana Territory that year, arriving not just as a change in weather, but as a transformation of spirit that touched every life in Clearwater Ridge. The snow melted with unusual swiftness, revealing a landscape that seemed somehow more vibrant, more alive than anyone remembered from previous years. Flowers bloomed in unexpected places, and the streams ran clear and strong with promise. Ezekiel Brant stood on the porch of his new cabin, positioned halfway between the high country he loved and the town that had become his responsibility. The structure was larger than his old mountain retreat, built to accommodate visitors and community meetings rather than just one man's solitary existence. Through the windows, he could see the leather journal where he still pressed flowers, not just as memorials to Sarah now, but as celebrations of beauty found in shared moments with living friends. The sound that drew his attention was one that had been absent from the valley for too many months. The clear, bright voice of a bell calling the community together. They had cast it themselves from donated metal. Old pots, worn tools, even Martha's treasured brass candlesticks melted down and reformed into something that could speak for all of them. The new bell hung in a simple wooden tower at the heart of town, its voice carrying easily across the scattered homesteads to let everyone know when they were needed. Today's call was for celebration, not crisis. It was exactly 1 year since the mountain lion crisis that had changed everything, and the community was gathering to commemorate not just their survival, but their transformation into something stronger and more enduring. As Zeke walked toward town, he passed landmarks that told the story of their collective rebirth. The Murphy place now showed signs of life beyond mere survival, a vegetable garden, fresh paint on the cabin, and Sean Murphy himself working contentedly in the afternoon sun. The old Irishman had found purpose as the settlement's unofficial historian, recording stories and keeping track of families as they grew and changed. The Jacobson farm had expanded considerably, with additional fields cleared and a new barn that housed not just their own livestock, but animals belonging to several families who pooled resources for mutual benefit. Young Emma Jacobson had grown taller and more confident, her pressed flower collection rivaling Zeke's own, as she documented the changing seasons with scientific precision. Thomas and Martha Henley had indeed established a medical practice, working alongside Doc Morrison to provide care for a community that now attracted new families, rather than losing them to distant promises of easier lives. Their cabin had become an unofficial meeting place where important decisions were made over Martha's coffee and Thomas's quietly authoritative guidance. Henrik Olsen had surprised everyone by revealing talents as a craftsman that went far beyond simple survival. His woodworking had provided furniture for newcomers and decorative touches that made the harsh mountain settlement feel more like a true home. More importantly, his experience of nearly giving up and then being saved by community action had made him an eloquent advocate for the mutual support that defined their new way of life. The town itself had grown, but thoughtfully, with new buildings placed to strengthen the sense of shared space rather than simply expanding in random directions. Sam Fletcher's store had become a true community center, where people gathered not just to trade, but to share news, plan projects, and solve problems together. The old church had been rebuilt, with a new minister who understood that frontier spirituality was as much about caring for neighbors as caring for souls. As Zeke approached the celebration, he could see children playing in the street, not just the Jacobson offspring, but youngsters from families who had arrived during the past year, drawn by stories of a mountain community that worked together instead of struggling in isolation. Their laughter echoed off the buildings like music, filling spaces that had once been silent with the sound of hope. Anna Jacobson's community quilt hung proudly in the window of the general store, but it was no longer the only symbol of their unity. New quilts were being created, each one telling the story of families who had found their place in this high valley where cooperation, conquered hardship and shared purpose made impossible dreams achievable. The feast that followed the bell's call was abundant in ways that went beyond mere food. Tables groaned under dishes that represented the diverse backgrounds of the families who now called Clearwater Ridge home. Norwegian lefse, Irish soda bread, German sausages, and American cornbread all sharing space with wild game and mountain vegetables. But it was the conversation that truly nourished those gathered around the long, communal table. Stories were shared of the past year's challenges and triumphs, the harsh winter they had weathered together, the new families they had welcomed, the businesses that had not just survived, but thrived because of community support. Young people spoke of futures they planned to build in the mountains, rather than dreams of escape to distant cities. As darkness settled over the valley and lanterns were lit to extend the celebration, Zeke found himself thinking about Sarah and the life they had planned to build together. The pain of loss remained, but it had been transformed into something that honored her memory rather than diminishing his ability to connect with others. She would have loved this community, would have been one of its strongest supporters and most generous contributors. Thomas raised his cup in a toast that captured what everyone was feeling. To the year that taught us the difference between surviving and living. To neighbors who became family, and to the truth that no one has to face life's challenges alone. The new bell continued to ring as the evening progressed, its voice carrying across the valley to homesteads where families worked by lamplight, secure in the knowledge that help was always just a signal away. It spoke of community bonds that had been tested by crisis and proven strong enough to support dreams that individual effort could never have achieved. As Zeke walked home under stars that seemed brighter than he remembered, he carried with him the sound of that bell and the knowledge that he had helped create something that would endure long after the mountains claimed his bones. The solitary mountain man was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from isolation, but from the willingness to care for others and accept their care in return. The mountains remained as beautiful and dangerous as ever, but they no longer seemed like a place of exile. They had become home,